Welcome to the Psycho Studios podcast. We're coming to you recorded live from the desert, Phoenix, Arizona. I am Mr. Z, and my co host is Mr. W. We are a father son team that brings smart and creativity to the podcast and our newsletter. We are a TV/film production company. Our focus and passion are on writing smart and original ideas. We are horror nuts. Don't take that the wrong way. We use the platform to connect with our psychos. We explore the art side of horror and related images, art pieces, and we hope you enjoy our revamped format. Topics that we will explore: film and music.
Yeah, we're going to keep it tight in regards to that. So last month was the first iteration of this new format, and we loved it. So we're definitely going to continue with that trend. So let's remind our audience that we want to leave the politics at the door. We're going to be fun, thought provoking, and value add. And we provide our listeners a space where news and notes are real. We are honest and care about our fellow humans. Why not stop scrolling for about an hour? Take a deep breath as we share gratitude and appreciation for the little things. Regarding the Psycho Studios podcast as well as our newsletter, The Sprinkler, each episode of our podcast will be fun and engaging, as will our newsletter. Every chapter of that newsletter will be written rather well and engaging. The Sprinkler will contain practical life skills to help our listeners with efficiency and money savings. We can all use that now. And we drop our podcast on the first of each month along with our newsletter. So no April Fools. We will be dropping that on the first. And we've trimmed our podcast and newsletter menu. We want to have our podcast come in around 50 minutes. Mr. Z is really good about keeping me on point with that.
Yeah, let's not hold that time though, because God knows we might be under at this time or way above
Yeah.
it. So
God only knows. I wish I could sing. Our newsletter has been tightened up as well. Check us out at our website, which is under continue evolution. And Mr. Z has really been knocking that out of the park. And check us out at psycho-studio.com. Again, that's psycho-studio.com. And I believe it's time for a quote. Mr. Z, what do you have for us?
so to go with our quote, you should know that we'll be covering the movie Psycho today in our podcast.
From 1960.
Right, the original black and white film. And so our quote of the day, like Peter Herman said, or something like that, we all go mad, a little mad sometimes.
Yeah, that we do. Boy, that's a classic line from that film. And um, outside of that quote, which is brought to us by the screenwriter as well as Anthony Perkins, we're going to be reviewing the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. And that album came out in 1966. As you can tell, that theme is we pick a movie from a certain era. Typically, it's going to be the original rather than the remake. And then we link an album that is from that same time period, as we did last month with Frank Sinatra Sings Cole Porter, which was tied into what movie?
Hmm. Oh, Creature from Black Lagoon? No, it's the Wolfman.
The Wolfman. Yep, the Wolfman. Hey, what's the matter with Wolfie? All right, so Psycho. Do you want to kick this
Well,
off, or do you?
I was just going to let you know.
Yeah,
So, how we should start it is, how about we give it our score? Because that's what we're known for.
nice. We are known for that.
So, we were talking about the movie we saw last night. We're not going to get into that right now. But he was talking about not doing a point 0.5 score. But I'm going to continue doing that because I think it's fitting for movies.
Okay, 0.5.
So, I'm going to give Psycho out of 10 because we rate things on a 1 to 10 scale. I'm going to give it a 9.5. So,
Wow.
what would you give it?
Yeah, and I know it's going to sound like I'm being a homer and a copycat, but I would bring the point 0.5 for this for sure. I don't know if I've ever rated a film a 10, and that's so lofty, but a 9.5, and that would be without question.
So, in your eyes, that's why I'm curious. What would you say would make it a 10?
Well, I think, and some of it could just be production. As great as Hitch was with his production and the people that he had working on his projects, the driving scenes do leave some thing to be desired just based on the way that he did that. I know that was kind of a signature of his, but I'm not a fan of that. And I also think that there just could have been more depth to some of the story and the dialogue. And ultimately, I'd have to say, I wish the film was probably another 20 minutes in length.
I want to just counter a little bit about the driving thing.
Yeah.
I think this was his best work with the driving, and there was actually a lot of shots of the cars, away shots, some in the rain showing reflections in the hood, like so artsy. Like I think he went above and beyond, and I think it really shows. I mean, for its era, a lot of the film scenes, you even see more recent shows like Mad Men,
Yeah.
where it still looks. I know they're trying to show like older times, but it almost feels like just watching like a psycho movie where it just something's off.
Yeah. And I mean specifically just when we're basically almost a reverse POV, right? We're looking
Right, we're
behind the
looking.
driver.
Yeah,
Other than that, what you mentioned about the cars themselves and the rain sequence and that, no, absolutely. I mean, I love that. It was definitely had that artsy nature to it. But I'm nitpicking. I just know that I if the film was a little bit longer, a little bit more substance to the story, I would have probably enjoyed it more. But it's a 9.5.
yeah. So the reason why I can't give it a 10 simply is just because, in my eyes, no movie could ever reach a 10. I mean, Oppenheimer, we talked about something more current. I think as close to a 10 as you can get. It's a 9.9, I would say.
Oh boy, he's gonna
But
do that.
it's just it's important to know that, it's basically a 10 in my eyes. So, especially 1960, that even for then that it's probably 11 back then.
Yeah, yeah, right off the scale. Well, and I think of that little girl in the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where the little girl is talking to Leonardo DiCaprio's character on the movie set, and she says something about, she knows that as an actor, her performance will never be perfect, but it's striving for that perfection. And I think that's what we see from Hitchcock. That's what we see from Christopher Nolan and even Wes Craven in his genre.
Right. Well, so getting away from the score, let's talk about how well the movie did. Do you know what the budget was?
I do $800,000, and in
Okay.
today's money, that would be about 8.4 million.
So this movie for, the director, well known, was his most successful film, right? At 50
Com-
million.
Commercially successful. Yeah, it's interesting. I never would have guessed that
Yeah.
that was the most commercially successful film
So,
for him.
like you were saying, so in today's dollars, that's 524,199,000.
Wow, half
So
a billion.
yeah, that's back then. That's kind of crazy. But to go into the money thing, she just so happens to steal 40,000, and that does equate to $419,359.46 today.
Well, and I love that tidbit because, and we might touch on it just briefly, but the scene by scene remake with Vince Vaughn and Anne Hesh, that character steals $400,000. So clearly, somebody that was doing the details was looking it up just like you did.
It's crazy to think because you think, well, you could do a lot of damage for 40,000, but you're like, wow, you're gonna really risk everything and steal that? But you put in that perspective back then, man, you could live the rest of your life like that. But
Well, yeah, and she references going to a private island, right?
right,
And there's so many, we could, I know that I had some reservations about this format from a time standpoint. Could we really fill the time? And then, of course, you helped me stand corrected with the fact that, yeah, we could, because there's so many threads. Like, even when you say a private island, Zack Snyder's remake of Dawn of the Dead, they reference a private island off of the lake shore of Wisconsin, and there is no such thing. But
hmm,
it's funny because they reference that, and then on top of it, what I loved about Hitchcock is that $40,000 that she had in cash. It was just in a big envelope,
hmm.
right? It wasn't like you'd see in old movies, especially in TV shows, where $40,000 would have been like two briefcases.
No, it seemed like you need a whole bank vault to hold it,
Yeah, we got 40,000 coming through.
but it was realistic. And
Totally.
the way, further on into the movie where she tries to figure out where she's gonna hide the money, but when she was switching out her car at the dealership, she had got the newspaper, and she figures out to put the money in the newspaper. Like it's so smart, and it didn't even stand out at all.
No, and she rolls it tight like she's wrapping fish or something in it.
Right.
And do you recall why would she have obtained a newspaper?
Right, because she was worried that she was in it. She
Perfect.
she was so great back then. You know, they feel like they had to narrate, but in this it fits where you're hearing like her sister's voice or
Oh, I
her
love that
boss's
part. Yep.
voice in her head and like what they're probably thinking or
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah.
No, the last time I saw her, she said she was going
Yeah,
home.
she was under the weather, and then he pauses, and he has a flashback of seeing her at the intersection.
Hmm.
Beautiful.
No, I was gonna say that that was such an awesome scene. You know, I think the movie does such a great job. I think even today, when we all have an anxiety to an extent, and we've all worked in a corporate environment, I'm sure at one point or another, and you're doing something or you say something that you want to go home or that, or you have the nervousness now that you're fine maybe and you want to go do something, but you leave and now you're like, is your boss gonna find out or one of your friends at work or something gonna see you and then they do? Are they gonna say something or what are they gonna do? But on this level, it's such a worse thing because she's obviously doing something way worse by stealing, almost a $500,000.
And she's so cool about it.
Yeah,
So cool.
and it's cool for that time period too, because I feel like a lot of movies in 1960, Arizona was known for, Wild West or the nothing developed, but this movie kind of made it like a grounded reality in that, yes, it was just Phoenix, and it opened up with that one of his famous opening shots like he always does. But and they talk about the heat and there's no AC, but there's AC in the boss's, the mail's office.
Yeah.
I,
It's hot as fresh milk.
yeah, it's too funny. And just wanted a sidebar real quick. I would watch uh, this Psycho TV show. It was called The Bates Motel,
Yeah.
and I had not seen the original Psycho in quite some time. Even after wrapping up watching that TV show, it is crazy the amount of juice that they squeezed from just this single movie. And like now, reflecting on it, like I was for this podcast, like the detailed and every square inch of that house, because it was black and white. I know that they have references of the wazoo, but they I don't know, like every corner they like mastered what that house looked like. I don't even know how they possibly did that. And that, not to mention the hotel itself, the carpeting. I was looking at the carpet where when he does kill the main character, like when he puts her in the shower curtain, like that carpet, you obviously can't tell what color it is, but the design's exactly the same like it is in the TV show. It's quite wild.
It is. It's incredible. And I'm sure some of that is the fact that that house and that hotel are part of Universal Studios tour, right? Like they're
Yeah,
they're they're a,
I've been on the tour, but you can't like get out or anything. But yeah, you get to see that house.
and it's a full-size house, right?
Yeah, but that's not. I think it's more of a facade, from my understanding.
Right. Yeah, I'm not saying it's fully
Right.
built, but it's size, it's got the height and width and that, right?
It definitely it's perspective because it definitely doesn't look that big when you're out on the lot,
And
and the hotel is very small too.
the hotel is small too. And
Motel, whatever.
okay, and it was the well, it is a motel, right? It's the Bates
Yeah,
Motel. So, but that's small as well.
yeah,
Okay,
it's really tiny.
and they had the Ford sitting out in front of it.
Yeah, so what when you're on like that trolley,
Yeah.
they have Norman like out
Oh, do they really?
closing the trunk,
Okay, perfect.
and then he starts chasing him when he go by.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to see. I wish that you could actually get out
Oh,
and
that
take
would
a
be
look around,
amazing.
but
Yeah, it is. But you're right about the details. And it's funny when we think I'll just I know we're bouncing around a little bit, but you brought up the Bates Motel as far as the TV show,
yeah,
and clearly the people that were behind that took some painstaking efforts to reference the original film, right? Maybe they even got a hold of Hitchcock's notes or the set designer's notes, and then I'm sure there was probably some computers involved with getting things generated. But yeah, I think the Bates Motel TV show might be the second best out of all the things, like you said, the juice that they've gotten out of the original. Because get this, and I have not seen one of these. I've seen them all but one of them. But so we have Psycho from 1960.
Yeah.
Then 23 years later, we get Psycho 2, 1983, right? With Anthony Perkins playing his role.
Right.
Psycho 3 comes out in 1986. Then get this, Bates Motel. And it's a feature. And I've never heard of it. How
Right.
could we have missed that? So that is 1987. And get this, it ignores the fact that Psycho 2 and Psycho 3 were even made.
Okay.
Then it jumps to Psycho 4, which then brings Anthony Perkins back in, I think, one of his last roles before he passed. That was 1990. That movie ignores the movie Bates Motel. And then I had to mention it because it's part of that. It's Psycho from 1998, which is that scene by scene remake.
Right. No, I didn't. I didn't dove that deep because I was just focusing on the first one.
Sure.
But I couldn't believe there's been that many sequels. Or it's so funny because you think about that. I'm sure those are really unwatchable, but that's why I feel like Halloween. I don't know if that's what they looked at, like the newer reboots. They looked at those and were like, yeah, we gotta do something like
We
that.
can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. And they are, especially if you are a huge fan of the original. I know that some critics have said that Psycho 2 has a lot of positivity to it and Anthony Perkins is really good in it. But they're terrible movies. They just are, especially if you want to think of its origin.
Yeah. Well, anyways, let's talk about something more positive, like the score of the movie. How can you talk about Psycho when the first thing, I mean, when it comes to my mind, is not even the movie, it's the score.
And when you say score, you're not talking 9.5.
That's funny, but I'm talking about the music.
Right. Bernard Herrmann.
And that music, how many times has that been copied?
Mm.
And how many is that resemble like Jaws? You like just it's strings, just strings.
Reanimator almost lifted it track for track.
Right, even like their title sequence is more animated for sure, but
Oh,
this title sequence, it's so sharp, just like the music, and it's so quick. It's beautiful.
it is. It's hard when I saw the title sequencing and I really sat down and absorbed the film. And you're right. That title sequence looks as contemporary as anything you'd see in today's theater.
Right. So, if you were in the situation she was in, where your life is going nowhere and you were just plopped back then, that vast amount of money, would you see yourself wanting just to take off, but would you be smarter about it?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think I did, and this is where you and I have this weird but positive synergy when we're not even talking about it because you've been really good about, hey, let's not share our notes in advance. And it's crazy how we do think about things similarly without communicating it. And I think about it. So she's stealing that money because she feels desperate to be with her boyfriend, right? Who is saying he's not going to get married to her or even have a normal relationship with her until he can get out from under his debt, from his father's passing to his alimony from his ex-wife.
Right. And he
And
works at a job that,
in
a
right,
hardware store.
right, just he's just picking up the pieces, right? And so she doesn't seem from an external standpoint to be that desperate, but clearly she is by her actions. And I would, because I think about in those times there are so many things in the favor of a criminal or criminal activity, right? You don't have cameras everywhere. There's no smartphones. There's no database that can easily find you. You can easily swap out license plates. Like there are so many positives, and I have to admit that when we know what we know now and what was going on in 1959 when the movie was shot, I would absolutely do it. I would take the money and run, and I would with 40 grand like that because I don't even know if there would have been restrictions of getting on a plane or anything like that, right? It would have been easy if you could afford an airline ticket. They weren't patting you down. There
Right. You
was
just
no,
put that money in your suitcase.
yeah, there was no TSA. So you grab the boyfriend. In this case, I would grab a girlfriend, and head out to a foreign country and you could live the rest of your life that way.
Yeah, and again, if this was back then, I would too, but I probably would be estranged from anyone, and I wouldn't worry about anyone and just restart my life over because that's what that money would do, especially in that circumstance. That's kind of where she was like going nowhere in life, and so
Would have you stayed in the States or would have you left the country?
I probably want to go to Europe and explore the world, and eventually, hopefully, do smart investments and make my way back to America, but under a new name.
Right. I mean, you'd have a whole new identity and that would have
Right.
been easily purchased back then.
Definitely a fake mustache when I come back.
Nice. That's awesome. Got to have the fake mustache. No, that's a great question. I like that.
So, going back to the beginning of the movie, did you, in your research, find anything about that opening shot?
Yeah, I did. As a matter of fact, thanks for asking. So you nailed it earlier. So that opening scene, it pans across the Phoenix skyline, and for those of you that live in the area, you probably do recognize it. The thing that really stands out is Camelback Mountain. It is a predominant part of that shot. But what I found even more interesting than the fact that they panned across that, right? So we get that opening scene after those amazing credits and that great score that you talked about. And then the camera slowly makes its way in from the outside into the hotel room, right?
Yep.
But Hitchcock, his original plan was that they would have been going from the inside out.
Right.
And when the technical experts, whatever their titles were at the time, were trying to basically storyboard or map out how that shot would work, the technology and or the equipment wasn't there to make that shot possible. So Hitch revised it to the shot that we saw. So it's funny how clearly Hitchcock was always trying to push that envelope.
I think one, it's overdone now, if you ask me, but Harry Potter in those movies, they have some of the best cinematography if
Cool.
you look at it just like that. But
Yeah,
they have the most wild transitions through windows, and it's seamless.
really.
Mostly you have to use CGI,
Sure.
but it like long sweeping shots, and they like smash through the window, but it's like the window's not there, but it shows that it's there.
And then you're inside.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's funny because I think ever since you were maybe single digits, you have talked about, you always call out transitions. And it is funny how it's kind of a lost art almost. You just don't see it that much, even with big productions.
and bringing back Mad Men, that's I think what made the show very special. The first 3 or 4 seasons, because they would always have the best transitions. And man, it really saddened me that they got the show. I think overall is great through the end, but they had some of the best transitions from opening a door, and you think you're watching them walk through the door, but it's another scenario where it's some other people
A
in the
scene
show.
change. Yeah. I thought, and I could be wrong with this, but this is my perception, is that Mad Men, that show, was shot a lot like small movies.
Yeah, totally. But anyways, going back to the actual movie that we're talking about, Psycho. Uh, is there anything from the beginning of the movie that really stands out to you? Is nice touches, or you know what makes it stand out over his other set of movies?
Well, I just think that, especially if we're talking about just the beginning of the movie, boy, I mean, again, I could say 100 things. So I think something that jumps out to me is, and it's hard to put that, hey, I'm in 1960 as opposed to 2024, but in the hotel room, Janet Leigh, her character, she is seen in a bra and a slip. And that was unheard of at that time. Shot in 59, released in 60. There was no way you showed a woman in just her bra without a cover up. And not to jump around too much, but so we're seeing Janet Leigh at the beginning before she steals the money, and she's in a white bra and white slip. And then later in the movie, when we see her after she's stolen the money, she's in a black bra and black slip. So you had white for good, black for bad. So there's so many things that jump out to me. And a little side note, so Janet Leigh's in a tryst, right, with her boyfriend. They're in the hotel room trying to hide from people. Clearly, Janet Leigh's character, Marion Crane, is tired of meeting that way, right? She's just had it. But I felt that the chemistry between her and the actor playing her boyfriend, I thought it was really spot on. And as a tidbit, Alfred Hitchcock took Janet Leigh aside after he saw the daily from that scene where they were on the bed, and he's like, I'm paraphrasing, but you've got to spice this up. I don't believe for a second that you two are lovers.
Right.
And she just kind of did improv. Improv. Okay, sorry. And we saw the end result, and so I thought little tidbits like that, what we end up seeing and what was done behind the scenes. But for me, it jumps out to me because I'm older about how that movie's opening was pretty risque for the time.
But what stands out to me is just how quick it is and how quick it's to build the world around you. But what he's always so good at is that his movies are never vast or on a huge scale. He's really good at making it about basically the individual of the who is it about the
It's all
story.
about the characters, right?
And he somehow, even though it goes on such a huge thrilling ride, still like is grounded. And there's nothing sci-fi. There's nothing like nothing about that movie is like, wow, there's no way that could happen.
Right. Totally believable.
Yeah,
You're totally immersed. And the bulk of the film is interior shots.
right.
Well, and I will call out the fact that the movie runs 109 minutes, but when you talk about pace, I that might be the fastest 109 minutes I've ever spent watching a movie.
It's definitely up there. And to move forward in the movie, it's when she's pulled over because she's getting tired and she sleeps in her car, and that cop. I know something about him even still to this day. After I saw it the first time, I feel like that's where a lot of other movies try to strive is to have that such a mysterious cop with those
Oh, the
sunglasses.
aviators, yeah.
But something about him, it seems almost inappropriate. Like he's not a good cop. Like but he's just doing his job. But you want to root for the other person 100% because it's just something about that cop just makes you want to get away from him.
Well, and it's great. It's almost a classic 1950s white male hard ass,
Yeah,
right? And then he was a cop. I think that's a great call out on your part. I will tell you that they said as a side note that Hitchcock had a total fear of police, and that's kind of where that storyline dropped off. But I think it feeds into what you're saying. He must have had influence on how that scene was shot and the way that cop was, because that cop is just unnerving and you feel like he's a bad guy, but you just said it. He was just doing his job.
yeah, and he was very suspicious of her, especially with how she was acting.
am I
And
am
then
I acting suspicious, officer?
and then he driving through town, and then he stumbles upon her, and then he drives on the other side of the lot, and then
He's parked across the street, right?
he's
And he's
just
just
staring.
standing and looking at her.
Hmm.
And the beauty of her character is as because you can feel her sense of nervousness. It's really both physical and mental, but she just plows right through, right?
Well, because I was thinking in that moment, what do you do though? Do you drive off
Because it
and
would
then
be
you look
worse, right?
even
Yeah,
worse, or do you? But you could tell even though she's on the run or leaving, she took the money. She's still a very confident woman,
totally.
especially back then. That she was definitely above average confident, and so she, still bulldozed through it, and then she thought it was over when she was leaving. After exchanging her car and paying, was it $700?
Yep. So it'll be my car and $700, and then she likes repeats that to the salesman, and she's like seven, and he's like, "Oh, we always have time to bicker about price, don't we?"
Yeah, but and just it's so funny, he is intentional with all his shots. When she goes in the bathroom, she takes out the money and then she counts it so carefully so you can see that she pulled out exactly
Perfect.
700.
Yeah.
And then but she also pauses and looks at all the money again. Still, is she gonna do the right thing? Is she gonna go back? But she just keeps on pursuing, and he's still giving her a hard time about you should just go test drive it still, you
Right.
know?
Well, and I I'm sure the majority of our audience is well aware of that character's demise, but up until that part of the movie, I think it might be one of the stronger female characters we see in any type of movie up to 1960.
Just and then so funny, her daughter became, a horror icon herself, and this similar way, a slasher, but she did survive her movie, and lived on, and is still today acting and being a horror queen.
And you're saying horror queen, right? Okay,
Yes,
just wanted to make sure for the audience.
that's
No, it
funny.
is interesting, right? You had Tony Curtis, who was a mega star at the time, married to Janet Leigh from Psycho, and they had a little baby named Jamie Lee Curtis, who from Halloween, right? You can't even make that up. It's
No,
hard to believe. And a little side note that was cool is John Carpenter did a little film called The Fog, and Janet Leigh and her daughter Jamie Lee Curtis are in that movie. I don't know if they're even in scenes together, maybe briefly, but just some really cool intertwining there when it comes to the horror genre.
that's for sure. So let's, touch on when she gets to the motel, Bates Motel.
Okay,
So, like,
Vacancy.
out of any movies that I've seen, there's been a few. I think they even try to use like the similar setup of that Bates Motel, but it's, evolves around mystery and mystique, evolving a murder that maybe took place around there, or they're investigating a murder nearby. But something even still for that original. There's something about that place, not even talking about any other character. The show up in the rain, and it seems like it's in the middle of nowhere, even though that used to be the main highway. It seems very, spooky and eerie.
Well, and it's such a simple premise that you talked about it a little while ago about there really is a believability through the whole movie. And that's another one of those where, yeah, it's a small motel and it has no more business because the highway, right? So 1960, you were talking about the suburban sprawl and the interstates being laid down throughout the country. Even Route 66 was becoming, a dinosaur in the not too distant future. So it made perfect sense that it was a dead business now because of the highway. And so, yeah, I mean, I love that part that you call that out.
And then you don't even notice that giant old house. Like that's not even. They're almost like trying to tease you, but not show you that.
Agreed. No, absolutely. And you talked about the rain, right? And how it was just pouring when
Yes.
she arrives.
And she leaves her. The first time watching it, like, why is she leaving the car on? But we've never been. I even in Arizona. I mean, that often in pouring rain, or I've been on a road trip. But it just makes perfect sense because no one was in there, and she ran back in. She honks the horn. There's all that was beautifully done, and she's waiting for him to come out.
Right. Again,
And
making sense, right? Because who knows? She might have had to get back in and take off, right?
yeah, and he doesn't even put the umbrella up for himself when he's running down. I was like, how does he not even hurt himself? But he's probably, how many times does he run down those stairs? But he's running down, and then he tries to put the umbrella up, but it's like she's already, inside, and he feels very apologetic, and nothing seems off,
No.
and so that's what's so beautiful about that, and just the movie keeps on moving, but you're not aware at all, especially if you're first time watching it. You have no idea what's about to happen.
And I reflect on that. They showed on the 4K DVD that you got me, there's some news footage. So it shows people standing in line to go into the theater and that. And those are the times where you think, man, it must have been amazing to see that for the first time. And of course, there's no inkling of what's happening. There's no news feed or anything like that. And I will give one more tidbit about the rain. So that was man-made rain that was on a sound stage, and they are shooting the movie. But as you know, that house is built, right? Even if it's just a facade, it's outside. It's not in an enclosed studio. And so the assistant director is so happy with himself. He's sure that everything's in place for the rain. It's such an important scene. And Hitchcock comes up and says, "So are we all ready?" And he's like, "Yeah, absolutely. We're good to go." And he's like, Hitchcock says, "I don't think you planned this very well." And the guy's heart just sank. And Hitchcock turns around and points above the house, and there's a full moon. And of course, you wouldn't see a full moon if it's raining like that. So, a couple of grips had to take a huge sheet and put it between a couple of pieces of wood, and they had to cover up the moon that entire evening and into the next morning for that shot so it would work and they could still pull it off.
That's awesome. Oh man. Uh, so after that night settles, you're starting to see more and more tendencies, especially when she says something nasty about his mom.
Ooh.
Everything was fine until she did that, and she thought, we can even see they thought that they were opening up and being honest with each other, and as soon as you know she said something too honestly to him, that's when he snaps.
Well, and the psychopathy of the fact that he hated his mother, which he was telling her in more than one way, but then as soon as something negative is said about his mom, which I believe had to do with maybe being put into an institution, his just his demeanor completely changed, and now he goes into protect mode.
So I don't know how many people actually read the actual book Psycho, but the main character, I should say, sorry, not main, but the Norman Bates, he is, I believe, uh, bald, heavy set, and short,
Frumpy, absolutely,
and
yeah.
nothing like that in the actual movie.
And do you know why they settled on Anthony Perkins as opposed to coming up with the character or an actor that looked like the person from the book?
No,
So Hitchcock and the screenwriter wanted there to be empathy and sympathy for the Norman Bates character at times, and they felt like that character in the book, no audience would ever have sympathy for somebody like that.
gotcha. That makes sense.
And that book was written in 1959 by Robert Bloch.
Yep, and Alfred paid $10,000 for the rights.
I know, an unheard of amount at that time.
Hmm.
Anything else you want to say about the book?
Uh, Alfred, he bought all the books so that no one could know what the ending of it was.
Did he really? I love that
Yeah,
part. I
he
didn't
went
see that.
everywhere and made sure that there was no way that it could be ruined. So he bought all those books.
Wow, that's brilliant. The book, and I may have already said it, but it's written by Robert Bloch, and it was based on Ed Gein, who is the killer from Plainfield, Wisconsin, and that his Ed Gein has been utilized in several other horror movies, at least bits and pieces, but the majority of the book Psycho was all about the killer from Plainfield, Wisconsin, Ed Gein.
Interesting. Also, for Norman Bates, only three actors recorded tried to be,
Oh,
Norman
really?
Bates.
Tested,
So,
yeah.
so they settle on him very quickly. And Alfred Hitchcock always likes to be in his movies, and he's at the very beginning of the movie. When they show a slight view of the Phoenix outside, he's wearing the cowboy hat. I just want to throw
No,
that in
he
there.
loves to have that cameo, and you're right. It's right in the office scene when Marion Crane is first going into the office. There's just a flash of him on the sidewalk, and in an article, he said that he wanted to get his cameo out of the way early because he didn't want the audience looking for him because that became his thing
Hmm.
because he wanted them to focus on the movie. So let me get in there right away.
Also, real quick, when the movie was released, it wasn't even rated. So
Non-rated, yep.
in 1984 is rated R.
25 years after its release, yep. Good call. Like that one. And I don't know if this will bounce us around too much, but you mentioned the book. So there was one really big difference between the book and the movie. And as gruesome as the movie was for its time, the book, I guess, is way more graphic.
Right. I can imagine. Makes sense.
Are you going to be talking specifically about the shower scene?
Uh, I I was just gonna, go over it, especially, the kill of it is so shocking. It's what 46 minutes into the movie basically, and the heroine that we have been following the entire time. You think movie's gonna keep on going on with her,
Janet Leigh, big time star.
and what we presume is the mother comes in out of nowhere and stabs her violently several times. It's so gruesome for back then, and blood's going everywhere. And uh, but when Norman comes in and cleans, I something about it's it's so beautifully done. I want to know how many times they did that cleanup part.
Oh, I know
But
it is. It's amazing.
when they show her body and they show her eye, I can only imagine how painful that was. How still, I mean, you can see like her throat move, like at the very end, but she did a pretty good job of not moving. But that was pretty good talent there. But the him using just a mop basically, and then he uses like a shower rag that was in there to clean out. It's so beautifully done, and you can totally tell. Like those questions you ask yourself. He's done this how many times
Right,
now, and
right.
just he has it down to like a science.
There's so many things that are popping off in my head with you talking about that. I'll just ramble through a couple that are related to that. So first and foremost, like you said, mother comes in and kills Janet Leigh, and in the book, Janet Leigh or Marion Crane is decapitated. To give you
Wow.
an idea how next level the book was from a gruesome standpoint, Janet Leigh talked about that scene you're talking about when her face is down on the floor and she has to hold still, and nothing was autofocus in that back then. So
Right.
she said that it was unbelievably painful to hold that. And another side note, according to her, I saw an interview with Janet Leigh. She said she never took a shower again the rest of her life.
Really.
She was so terrified and felt that she didn't realize how vulnerable a woman is when she's taking a shower, maybe more so than any other time in her life. So never went back and took a shower.
So baths then?
I'm going to assume so. She looked like she took care of herself. Um, any other things you want to ramble through?
Unfortunately, we're at the end of how much time we could really talk about Psycho if we're going to talk about music. So,
Well, you'll probably have to extend it just a little bit. Can I run through a few things?
uh, so, uh, I always found it interesting this, fact that Psycho is the first American film to feature a toilet, which I still think is such an odd thing to think about.
Specifically, a toilet flushing.
And that just, that really shows you how like repressed Americans were in the 1950s. Like,
Great point.
how
Great
could that
point.
be taboo? And
So when do they show it? How come they're showing the toilet flush? Do you remember?
um, I forget. Is it when she's tearing
Yeah,
stuff up and
she's got like a note that she ends up
the
tearing up and she
she's
flushes it.
doing the math on how much she
Yep,
stole, even though
yep.
that wouldn't be that hard to figure out in your head. But
Good point. She might not have been good at math.
no, but come on,
No, come on,
40,000
no.
minus 700.
Some people stop it.
All right, fine. She was probably just nervous and freaking out.
That too. That too.
All right, go ahead.
So no, I love that. That's a great call out there. So I'm just going to run through some other interesting tidbits that we have to share with the audience before we wrap this up. Hitchcock really liked the second script, as it were. The first script he was presented, he felt was limp, and he truly enjoyed the fact that he got a big time actress to play Marion with such a twist, right? Like you said, it was unheard of. Screenwriter Joseph Stefano still couldn't believe that Hitchcock was going to pull that off. Hitchcock shared with the screenwriter that his wife loved the first written scene, which was the shower scene. And that's Alma Hitchcock, who was influential way more than we realize. Hitchcock decided from the start that Psycho would be shot in black and white due to the gore, and he wanted the picture to be simple, made for under $1 million. And then he used a crew from his TV show almost everyone on the movie set was from the TV show, which was again very unusual. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago, but Hitchcock had seen this other production company who will go nameless start shooting these cheap, low budget horror movies. And Hitchcock just said, why can't I do one with a lower budget, obviously still higher than those B movies,
Right.
but with great writing and acting? And, the rest is kind of history there. You talked about the dumpiness of the character in the book. So, what a great, I mean, we know that Anthony Perkins is always going to be remembered in that role. Um, Interestingly enough, there's a lot of negativity about Hitchcock. If you read different things about him, different actors that worked with him, especially Tippi Hedren in The Birds. But Janet Leigh loved working with Hitchcock, and obviously quite a contrast from Tippi Hedren. And then Vera Miles, who plays Marion Crane's sister, she was supposed to have been in Hitchcock's Vertigo, but she got pregnant. And Hitchcock was furious about it because of the planning of having her in Vertigo with James Stewart. And she just couldn't do it. So he still hired her again to play Marion's sister. So I think we have to take some of that. I'm not saying Hitchcock was a saint, but there's quite a contrast between him being such a monster on the set to things that we also see played out. And the girl who plays Marion Crane's coworker in that non refrigerator office, right? She's talking about taking. My husband was so upset with me because I took a
Yeah,
tranquilizer on our honey.
take these pills to make you feel better.
That was Alfred Hitchcock's daughter.
Yeah.
So I love that tidbit there. I never knew that that was his daughter. So I really had to share that. And then Hitchcock intentionally, like you said, he went and bought all the books up for Psycho. He did other things also, like he
Prevented the critics from seeing the movie.
right. So that's why critics were so pissed, right? He didn't let him do any advanced screenings, but what he also did was he reached out and had the publicist reach out and the casting director. Hey, we're looking for a woman, an older woman, to play the mother, right? So he's trying to throw off the ending, right, by saying we're casting for the mother. So a lot of little tricks that he did. Such a smart guy in so many ways. Only location scene, you talked about it at the used car dealership. Everything else was done at the studio. That was the only location scene. Yes, they did shoot that intro, but an actual scene from the movie itself, and that used car dealer was 3 blocks down from Universal Studios. Food was important to Hitchcock in scenes, along with sex, sexual imagery, in contrast to murder. You talked about the toilet flushing. I love that part. The shower scene took 7 shooting days to complete. The movie itself took about 4 weeks. The use of melons to stab to make the sound of the knife into the body was unique. That was a cassava melon. And do you know what they used for blood?
No.
Chocolate syrup.
Makes sense.
Right? Black and white movie. They could get away with it. Virginia Gregg was the voice of the mother in all the Psycho films. The stuttering of Norman Bates, if you remember, when he's under stress, he starts to stutter. Very similar to the character in the movie Rope by Hitchcock. When that main character was under stress, he started to stutter. One of the most challenging things to get the censorship board was the psychiatrist explaining what a transvestite was, ultimately clearing the word after learning its definition. I have to just a couple more. And outside of that, we're talking about the music score by Bernard Herrmann. You mentioned that. So get this. Interestingly enough, 3 notes from the theme from Psycho were used in the movie Star Wars. I love that little tidbit. Janet Leigh never took a shower after she watched. We talked about that. Hitch was able to get the studios to enforce in the theaters to not let anyone in the show after it started. And that was strictly regulated. He even hired Pinkerton Police, which is a big-time security force across the country. The critics did not think Psycho was up to the standards of his other features. And we hear this a lot about old movies, old music, that the critics didn't like it initially, and then they ended up realizing how great it was. The movie was basically shot down in the United States initially by critics, but surprisingly, the United Kingdom, they loved it over there, not only the fans, but also the critics. And I didn't know that movies were that worldwide back then. So I don't know if that was unusual for Psycho or not, but it was a hit across the pond to say the least. You talked about it being his most financially successful film, and we talked about the list of the Psycho films, which is a catalog of 6. So everybody should check those out. Sorry for running long. Let's jump into from that amazing movie. Let's jump into Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys.
Yeah, so we'll have to just, quick fire this and not go into much detail. So, the album came out in 1966, and we'll just real quick, the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys are an American rock band formed in Hawthorne, California in 1961. They were one of the most influential and critically acclaimed bands in the history of popular music. And so just just so people know, it was just a bunch of, brothers, cousins, and one friend.
Yep.
And Brian Wilson, he was the primary songwriter, producer, and the one that arranged the group.
The guy with the talent.
Right. And so they came out, with that first album, with the huge, like, Southern California beach tunes, the culture, it definitely, happy, go getter. Like, that's the first album. But if you think about, Pet Sounds, their next, big album, that's the one where you think of them. And it's so deep and sad. And it's so crazy to me that, they recorded in 1966 and 67 uh, their second album, Smile, right? But that was actually never released until completion in 2011.
Wow.
So they actually, that never came out. That's so crazy to think about.
And the other part that's crazy to me, you talked about the fact that Pet Sounds came out in 66. That original album had 13 tracks on it, and it was only 36 minutes long. When Brian Wilson remixed it and released it again in 1997, it had 27 tracks and a runtime of 76 minutes.
But a lot of them are repeats and not, because back then, a lot of music, no problem, but was mono.
Right.
And so in today's audio world, doesn't sound so good. I mean, I can only imagine. I shout out to Dank Pods, but it's a YouTuber that I watch. He's all about music and how to listen to it with headphones. One day, I eventually want to get some crazy headphones that he talks about. But I have AirPod Pros, and they have like a way that you kind of can hear like the instruments where they're actually coming from.
Wow.
And when I was listening to the mono sounds, I was like, yeah, this sounds pretty good. But when you listen to like the remaster and the ones that are mono, and it's pretty impressive for, people call it a boy band, but if you really think about their songs and their, the mystique and this, it's definitely the addiction in the group and what they really went through. It's pretty crazy actually.
Yeah, Pet Sounds was such a departure, and from everything we know, Brian Wilson really did that album himself.
Right.
Anyway, and I know you mentioned about the fact that it was basically a family affair, but let's at least pay homage to the fact that the members of the band were Brian, Dennis, and Carl Wilson, Mike Love, who was the cousin, and then Al Jardine and Bruce Johnston. I at least want to get their names out there.
Okay.
My top 3 tracks on this album, you had mentioned that to me before. Wouldn't It Be Nice? I know that might seem like, oh boy, he's going to pick that one, but I just love that song and how it makes me feel. Don't Talk, and then Sloop John B.
Yeah.
And Sloop was either a single masted sailboat or a social blunder. So,
Put Your Hand on My Shoulder.
yeah, that's a great one. And
That I think that's the one that's, stands out the most to me because it's just it can be so, and again, music's what you want it to be, but a lot of their songs are like about the woman still loving someone else and that they'll be there while that's happening and then after, but what that's doing to them, and things will never be the same afterward anyways. It's just
well, it was such a departure from, nothing, not that there was anything wrong with it, but like Surfing USA and um,
Surfer Girl,
My Little Deuce Coupe.
Surfing Safari.
Right, right. I mean, those were fun songs, but this album was so different, right? And it wasn't received well initially.
Mm-mm.
Sounds like, Psycho again, right? So much of this, right? In the UK, it was met with rave reviews and was number two on the charts for many weeks. Eventually, the album became a critical success, and by people in the music business is considered one of the greatest and influential rock albums of all time.
Yeah, that's in history.
History. Right, which is hard to believe, right? Produced, arranged, and composed almost entirely by Brian Wilson. He said he set out to make the greatest rock album of all time, and he credited part of his inspiration from marijuana, and several songs are about drugs, as you mentioned.
Well, yeah, because he suffered with mental health issues, and that was, a lot of bands suffered through that kind of stuff, but that was really pushed into the media big time, and that was really on, I think, why people kind of hesitated with the newer music too, is this his substance abuse and then his mental health issues.
Well, it was such a stigma, right? You can't tell people that you have mental health issues or addiction, and now we know that that's done a 180. But yeah, it was like taboo back then.
For sure.
And we talked about too that for yes, he did that album pretty much by himself, but studio musicians replaced the band members for almost like 90% of that album.
Yeah,
Get this. Do you know how much it cost to make?
that I do not know.
$70,000 to produce that album, which is about 650,000 in today's money. Can you imagine?
Well,
Like, I can't. That number, I had to double check it to make sure I was looking at it correctly.
that's that made my jaw drop.
Is that the sound I heard?
Yes, but just a little bit more, just in their later career, they still performed through the 1970s and beyond, which is, I think, pretty incredible. Uh, they had a little bit of resurgence in the 1980s and released another album, which became on the topping of the chart.
Oh, did it? It topped the
And
charts
I
again?
can't even pronounce that. Cuckoo,
Yeah. Kokomo?
yeah,
Is that? I,
Kokomo.
I don't know. Yeah, I always had struggled with that myself.
But they were also introduced in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988.
Nice. Go Cleveland.
Sure. But back to the album itself, because we're just about to wrap up. I want to give it a score, just like we did with the movie.
Sure.
Uh, I think music you definitely could give tens, but I'm gonna give this also just like the Psycho score a 9.5. And I'm not talking about his remastering, not talking about the really extended. I'm talking about the pure original format that I was meant to listen in. It's, from my perspective, heart wrenching sadness, and you can hear the mental health of abuse with girls and mind games and, you know, feelings from within. I feel like anyone can relate to that if they've been there. And I think it's definitely close to being a masterpiece.
Boy, those are great points. I'm going to come in at a nine. And I know Mr. Z is going to want me to revamp some of this because he doesn't like it when I just read. But I've got a few bullet points that I think are so key to things that Mr. Z has talked about. So, Pet Sounds revolutionized music production and the role of professional record producers. And we're talking about 1966, right? And a lot of people think the Beach Boys, but yeah, that album was something. Um, Brian Wilson said that he credited Rubber Soul by the Beatles in 1965 as his main motivator for Pet Sounds. The Beatles' use of the sitar on Rubber Soul inspired Wilson for the instrumentation on his album. Brian held prayer sessions with brother Carl during the making of the album. Carl wasn't even in the band. Wilson's first LSD trip in 1965 brought him the revelation he saw God. LSD trips inspired him, and weed gave him creative freedom. That's right from him. Much of the lyric songs were centered around Wilson's marital struggles. And then Wilson said he was not interested in copying the Beatles and wanted to get back to classic American love songs like those written by Cole Porter from our last podcast. The disappointment and loss of innocence that everyone had to go through when they grow up, which Mr. Z pretty much was talking about, is the album's main theme. I felt the album contained sad songs about loneliness and heartache, sad songs even about happiness, if that's possible. And Brian Wilson was seemingly unhappy about the lack of critical acclaim and the album's success in the US, even though the album was kicking ass in the UK. And in the decades since its release, we talked about how it's been influential in all genres: rock, pop, hip hop, jazz, and punk. And then just a quick random thing that we have to relate to because this is near and dear to me. Dennis Wilson, another member of the band, was briefly friends with Charles Manson. And Dennis Wilson's close friend Terry Melcher was an influential record producer at Columbia Records. Melcher did not like Manson and refrained from inviting Manson to his home at 10050 Celio Drive in Benedict Cannon. Brian has had a wild ride since the 60s. Mr. Z talked about it: drugs, eating disorder, reclusiveness, lost tons of money, his marriage, and the like. And in 2023, get this, he celebrated his 81st birthday. And as Jim Morrison would sing, he broke through to the other side.
Well, I just want to say thank you for everyone listening. I enjoyed talking about Psycho. I'm looking forward to watching a new movie for the next podcast, and we'll be releasing this and our newsletter on April 1st. So I appreciate everyone tuning in and listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for those closing sentiments, and thanks for listening specifically to episode 8 of Psycho Studios podcast. Did you want to give one takeaway before we split?
That we still need some work on narrowing down how long we're going to be doing what.
All right, fair enough. And I think for me, my takeaway is some of the older stuff from back in the day it's still so beautiful.
And relevant.
Yeah, and relevant, right? We love to hear from our audience. Comments, feedback, and suggestions are welcome. Email us at psychostudio66@gmail.com. Reach us at our beautiful website, psycho-studio.com. And as Mr. Z said, we'll be dropping, or he will be, the newsletter and this podcast on April 1st. Be safe and stay psycho.